Grief is here to teach us things. It's here to really help move us through this experience of loss. We have to let loss change us. Acceptance doesn't mean that it's okay that they died. Acceptance means you're accepting the reality that you're living this life with them not here.
Claire Bidwell-Smith is a grief expert, an internationally renowned author. She's written 5 books to date, including The Rules of Inheritance. And as a therapist, she's helped thousands of people across the world work through painful loss and suffering. Grief, loss, rebuilding your life.
In grief, friends become strangers and strangers become friends.
Men and women, do they grieve the same? Claire, welcome to Slay.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for joining us. I want to kick off just with a really simple, easy question just to get us all settled in. Why did you become a grief counsellor?
It's definitely not what I wanted to be when I was growing up. Have you ever heard a kid say, I want to be a grief therapist when I'm growing up? No, me neither. I became a grief therapist because my parents died when I was really young, and I always wanted to be a writer. So I've accomplished that. I've written 5 books. And if you had asked me when I was a teenager, that is what I would have told you I wanted to do. But when I was 14, both of my parents got cancer at the same time. My mother had colon cancer. My father had prostate cancer. My mom died when I was 18. And she and I were so close. I'm an only child, and we were just so connected. She was an amazing mom, really fun and magical and a little rule breaky. And it dropped the floor out from underneath me. You know, she was sick for 4.5, 5 years. And during that time, I think she had a really hard time facing the idea of death. And my father didn't talk about it. And so we just didn't talk about it. And so when she died, it really came as a surprise, even though she was so sick. I just hadn't considered that I might lose her. She died my freshman year of college. And yeah, it was the thing that completely changed my life. From there on, I can look back at life before that moment and life after. And I think anyone who's really been through big loss can say something similar. My father died 7 years later. And I was his caregiver in hospice, and he died at home, and they had very different deaths. My mother's was a little more fraught and a lot unsaid. My father really kind of embraced the end of his life and died in a kind of beautiful way. I was there with him holding his hand. But nonetheless, I entered into young adulthood with no immediate family, a lot of grief, a lot of anxiety, a lot of big existential questions, kind of hit rock bottom in a lot of ways in my 20s. And then as I began to climb out of it, I discovered therapy, I discovered a lot of different tools, and eventually decided I wanted to go into this field and help others move through it as well. Wow. So that's a long answer too.
Yeah, first and foremost, I'm so sorry.
Thank you.
And then I was just thinking about, you had so much to deal with at such a young age. I first lost my father at age 23, and then my mother, I think it was around about age 33. 14 years old, though. Do you feel like you knew what was happening at the time? You mentioned there, like, not really, it hitting you like a brick wall. Do you feel like as a 14-year-old we have the skills, or, a young adult has the skills to process what's going on? Or is there a certain element of denial that goes on?
Absolutely, there's an element of denial. I mean, developmentally, we aren't capable of processing death and loss in the same way at age 14 as we are at age 30. So I was very much caught up in the regular 14-year-old things, my friends, school, boys, my extracurricular stuff. And so I was still very determined to be in that world. And at the same time, my home was really changing and my mother was changing. So I wasn't not aware of it, but it was hard for me to fully understand it, not in the way that someone does in adulthood when they're facing that kind of loss.
From your recollection, what ways was the home changing? What did you feel? What can you remember from that time?
Well, just my mother being really sick. She had a lot of big operations and chemo and radiation. Her hair was falling out. She just wasn't the mom she had always been. She wasn't able to show up in all the ways that she always had. And I missed her, and she looked different. And, I have teenage daughters now, and they're so concerned with their bodies and how they look all the time. And I can reflect now and think, I do understand why it was so hard for me to see my mother change in that way at this time that I was becoming really conscious of my own body and what I wanted to feel like and look like. And so, there was a lot I was aware of, but she didn't talk about it really. And my father didn't talk about it. There was no one around me that was helping me talk about it or think about it. It was very, it was the 90s. And I think we have made a lot of progress in terms of holding space for grief and talking about end of life. Not enough progress, in my opinion, but we've definitely made progress since then. And so there was just no one around me really helping me process what was happening. It was more of the attitude of like, oh, let's just move through it, get back to it, go to school, everything will be fine, don't think about it.
What do you think could have been better about that stage of your life, and what support, now what support would you have liked and have enjoyed back then that would have perhaps made it a little bit easier for you?
I don't know if seeing a therapist for myself at that time would have helped, but I think just some more open and honest conversations with my parents about what was happening. I think they didn't have the language or maybe the even emotional capacity to talk about it. They were also scared. They were grappling with all kinds of things. I was a writer. I've always been a writer since I was a little kid. So I turned to writing and I wrote through it. And it was the thing that saved me in many ways and pulled me through. And it's now a practice I use with my clients, is writing in many, many different ways. And I really utilized that heavily when I was trying to process on my own. So I'm grateful to that.
If you could advise your friends, friends that perhaps still have both their parents, we're both sat here as two adults that have both unfortunately lost their parents. But if you could advise your friends that still have both of their parents, what conversations would you be encouraging them to have?
Just more honest ones, I think we can fall into patterns, especially with family, where we get into the same kind of conversations or we avoid the same topics. But really, maybe trying to help yourself think about, what if they were gone tomorrow? Are there things I want to know? Are there things I want to say to them? Are there things we want to do together? Is there anything unresolved that we need to work through? So often when I'm working with clients who've just lost someone, those are all the things. Oh, I wish I had done this. I wish I had said this more. I wish we had gotten through this argument or this issue. So really kind of thinking about, what would you regret?
Is there anything that you wish that you could have said to your parents now that they're not here?
Not my father. Again, I think because my mother had died, I knew I was facing his death, and I was now living with all the regret around my mother's death. So I went into my father's death determined to not have any regrets. And we did have a beautiful experience together and said all the things, and I was with him through every moment of his dying days. With my mother, though, it was such a tricky age. Mothers and daughters, I was pushing and pulling against her in a natural way.
Yeah.
She was, declining and unable to kind of move through it in the same way. So, there were things that had happened, fights or arguments, or me being, a petulant kid. And I wished so much I could go back and just tell her I was sorry for those things, or just show up for her in a way that I didn't understand how to do. I wasn't there when she died. I was at college. My parents had told me to stay there. My dad called me at the very end and said, we think she's dying now, if you want to come. And I did. I left to drive there. She was at a hospital 7 hours away from where I was going to school. And I left to drive there. And halfway there, I got scared and I stopped to see a boy I had a crush on. And I stayed the night, and she died that night while I was there. And the moment I heard the news that she was gone, all I felt was guilt and regret. And I just hated myself for not having made it to her side. Now, almost 30 years later, I can look back with such compassion at my 18-year-old self. I had no idea what I was doing or how to show up in that moment. There was no role models for it. Of course, I stopped to see a dumb boy, but for years, I had so much guilt and regret around that.
I remember the night that my mother passed, we got into an absolute blazing row, which was really unusual for us. Normally, we'd have the odd tiff, but nothing like this. And I remember throwing my phone across the floor. Like, I was so irate. And I was really angry that she wasn't taking care of herself. I think she was having a Guinness that night. And I'm like, what are you doing? You're unwell. My mum loved a Guinness. And I remember she passed that night, and I received a message. In fact, I think later on that day, you know, I apologized to her and I was like, I'm so sorry, like, you know, that I was really angry at you. Like, I'm just really worried about you. She said, it's okay. And she just said that she loved me. And we were not like super, like, there wasn't a huge amount of like verbal affection in our relationship. And so that being like the last message that I had,
gift.
yeah, I was like, wow, I feel like, you know, I felt like she knew. I didn't know. I feel like it was a real shock to me. I didn't know that she was going to pass away, but I think that she knew. And as I was going through in the later stages, going through some of her affairs, I found like a couple of notes and I was just like, oh, wow, she really knew that she was probably closer to death than I think she cared to admit.
Wow.
And I think that she really kept that to herself. And I think it's really interesting how people do that. And I imagine you've probably heard a lot about that, you know, in your work and what you do. Why do you think people try to protect us from death?
Oh, I think they're trying to protect themselves in some way. You know, I think death is the great mystery, right? We're all afraid of it. I think that the fear of death is something that drives so much of all of our decisions in our lives. I think culturally, you know, Western culture is terrible at talking about death.
Why are we so bad?
Because we're scared of it. You know, we're really afraid of it. And right now in our culture, it's this whole movement towards longevity and health and, you know, how can we live forever? And so it's the opposite. And no one wants to talk about death. I thought maybe during the pandemic, there was a brief period where people started recognizing that it would be helpful to plan for end of life, maybe even when we're healthy and young. But it disappeared again. People were into it for like a minute. And then as soon as the pandemic started to end, people were right back into their denial of death. But I have found in my years of doing this work that it's precisely embracing the fact that there is an end to life that can help you live a more authentic and meaningful life. And I think anyone who's been through big loss like you have, you realize that like life is short, but there's a beauty to that. And it gives you an awareness that can motivate you to make really incredible choices, you know, to value your time and the people that are in your life. And there's a lot that I don't take for granted that I often wonder, you know, would I, if I hadn't been through what I've been through.
How do we plan for the end of life?
There's a lot of practical things we can do, obviously, you know, just even like, you know, does Eric know all your passwords and where all your stuff is and your bank accounts and, you know, Facebook and there's just so many things like that. What if any precious objects of yours, where would they go? Do you have journals you want burned or, you know, all of these kinds of things?
Oh, good question. I hadn't thought about that. Like, I'll give you a bit of intel, guys. So just on like the passwords and all of that stuff, Eric and I have a system, don't we? So we do have a lot of that stuff really organized. And I think, like you say, like from that experience, one of the things I found in losing my mum was like, wow, like this is a person who's not as organized as I am. How do I possibly know where everything is? What bank accounts, so on and so forth, all the things you've said.
Yeah.
Didn't think about the journals and all of the old love letters and cards. You know what I mean?
There's a lot of like, there's stuff and there's practical things, but then there's the emotional things too. You know, what a gift that your mom said that she loved you and her last message to you. Sometimes one of the things we can do to plan for death is just make sure people know how we feel about them. Or if you have anything unresolved, maybe you have a friend you had a falling out with a few years ago. What if you found out tomorrow that she was gone? Is there anything you would have wanted to say or do? Or, you know, just thinking about those kinds of things. I think people get really scared to do that because it feels superstitious on some level. I have a friend who's a death doula, and she says, talking about sex won't get you pregnant and talking about death won't make you dead.
Got you.
And I just love that.
Good advice.
Yeah. But so talking about it isn't going to, you know, ensure that you're going to die next week, but it ensures that when you do, all your things are in order and people know that, you know, how you felt about them and what you wanted things to be like.
What don't most people know about grief? What do you feel like people walk, you know, when they're looking for help? Is there like a commonality where everyone's just like in the dark about one certain thing?
The thing I hear most often from people is that they come into my office and they say, I'm doing this wrong. I must be doing this wrong. I'm doing it wrong. The thing that most people don't get is there's not a right way to grieve necessarily. I think that it really, truly looks different for everyone. You can think about each relationship that you have, each person you lose is going to have a different impact, right? My mother's death and my father's death were two very different deaths, different relationships, the circumstances, the ages they were, I was. All of those things inform the grief that I experience. So each process is going to be different for everyone. And so there's not one perfect formulaic way to move through grief. The only way to really move through grief is to actually open up to it. I think
How do you do that?
You don't distract yourself with work and all kinds of other ways that we find to just numb out from feeling big emotional experiences. Grief is here to teach us things. It's here to really help move us through this experience of loss. We start grieving really early on in our lives. We don't just grieve people who die. We grieve pets, we grieve homes that we move from, we grieve jobs that we don't get, or teams we don't get to be on, or a teacher that leaves midway through school. We grieve so many things throughout our lifetime, and it's a natural process. And so we have to let ourselves open up to it and feel it in order to kind of get through to the other side. But there's so many good things to learn along the way. Again, it teaches us a lot of meaning.
How many stages of grief would you say there are?
Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was the one who came up with the 5 stages of grief, which are denial, bargaining, anger, depression, and acceptance. Those stages have really kind of been pushed to the side lately more so than ever. But what's interesting about those stages is that she came up with them for dying people in the 60s. Dr. Kubler-Ross is no longer alive, but she was a doctor in the 60s, a psychiatrist, and she was observing that patients who were dying were going through that process.
Right.
And it's a really linear process, right? You first receive news you're dying, you're in denial, then you get angry about it. Then you start bargaining, maybe with your doctor or your higher power or your health. I'm going to stop smoking. I'm going to do whatever. Then you kind of sink into a depression. And then you come around to an acceptance that this is happening. That works really great for approaching death. Those stages were later applied to the grief process, and they don't fit as well. I think we come in and out of a lot of different experiences when we're grieving. We can go through all of those, yes, but there's more too. There's anxiety, there's longing, there's yearning, there's fear, there's rage. There's so many different aspects to grief. And the bottom line is that it's not a linear process. As you know, you can feel more than one thing at once. Maybe you're feeling fine one day, finally, again. You're really feeling like you're back to yourself on some level. 2 weeks later, you get hit with some kind of trigger or something and your grief is back, right? So it's not that you just kind of move through it and are done. It's very cyclical. It circles back. Old grief resurfaces with new loss. I'm sure your father's death came back up for you when your mother died. It's all interconnected and not quite really a stage model anymore.
Now, circling back, you mentioned the word anxiety, and we have one of your 5 books here, Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. Now, this is something that's actually been coming up in our household quite a lot, because Eric actually said, my husband, that I'm the most anxious person he knows, which I took personally as a
My
compliment.
husband might argue with Eric, and let's tell Eric that I'm the most anxious person out there.
Let's let them have it out over a cup of coffee. Can you share more about this connection and how people can recognize when their anxiety might be, rearing its head as unprocessed grief?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really common response to loss. Not everybody experiences anxiety when they go through a big loss, but many, many people do. It was my initial experience of grief when my mother died. I wasn't sad. I didn't even cry for the first year. I was so shocked and so numb, but I was incredibly anxious. I was suddenly having panic attacks. I thought I was having heart palpitations. I thought I was going crazy. I went to the ER. They would hook me up to things. They would tell me I was perfectly healthy, send me on my way. No one ever asked what was going on in my life, how I was. Wow. I would have told them my mother had just died. I was at college. I was worried about my father. All of these things really can contribute to anxiety. When we lose someone significant in our lives, our brains have to remap the world without them, right? So our whole understanding of the world, the future, the landscape of our life changes. That's incredibly anxiety provoking. We also now know that people die. We think we know this, right? Yeah. We think we know this until it happens. And when it happens, we're suddenly very, much confronted with our own mortality and the mortality of everyone else around us. So we begin to worry, what else is going to happen? Who else am I going to lose? What's going to happen to me? We become hypervigilant. Our nervous system is impacted. And then you throw in the fact that, again, our culture isn't really making that space for grief and asking you to sit in your grief. So we're stuffing the grief away on top of it all. And it's all starting to bubble out in anxiety, where we're trying to fit back into our world, but we're not the same person that we were before the loss. And that can be incredibly disruptive to every way that we understand the world and ourselves.
What ways do you think society can hold more space for people that are grieving?
I think we just need to talk about it more and recognize it. I mean, look, in the US, since the pandemic, it's been 5 years now. We have not had any kind of national memorial or recognition of how many people died of COVID-19. I started seeing clients as early as June of 2020 who had lost someone to COVID, who'd had goodbyes over FaceTime with nurses. There's so many people still carrying that grief and still going through those losses. And there's been no recognition of that grief that people are carrying. You can look at bereavement leave, which is non-existent, or maybe a few days. And is it relegated to, what kind of person? Do you have to be married to get bereavement leave? Does it have to be a parent? What about a step parent? Those are all messages about how long we get to grieve, who we get to grieve, what we get to grieve. You think about how everybody shows up in the beginning of a loss, right? Everyone shows up in the first few weeks. They bring casseroles, they call. And then 6 months in, you're starting to actually feel the grief for the first time, and everyone's backed off. They're wondering, why aren't you back to yourself? And you're really just starting to feel it in the first ways.
So do you think there's an expedience to the way in which we're being told to kind of just move on and kind of just work through? Should we be sitting in our grief longer, or should we be looking to fix it? Is it fixable?
Can't fix it. Definitely can't. And that's the hard problem. We're a fix-it culture. We really like to fix problems. Grief is not a problem, and it's not something we can fix. Grief is an experience that we really have to feel in order to move through it, right? So what we need to be able to do is actually just sit in the uncomfortability of it. So often, and maybe you know this to be true from your own experience, people are so afraid of saying the wrong thing to someone who's grieving that they don't say anything at all.
Yes.
They don't call, they don't text, they don't come by, because they're so afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing, or if they acknowledge your loss, it's going to upset you. And you can ask any grieving person, you're never not thinking about it when you're going through a big loss. But then everybody stops checking in on you because they're afraid to talk to you. We need to show up, even if you don't know what to say. Just show up and say, hey, I'm thinking about you. Text someone. Put an anniversary in your calendar. I have so many anniversaries in my calendar. I have to check it every day because I'm like, whose anniversary is today? And whether it's a client or it's a friend or someone, and I'll just send a text, hey, I know it's your mom's death day, thinking of you. And it means so much.
I love the idea of that. So do you feel like we should be scheduling alongside birthdays, those really memorable days for the people who we care about in our lives that have lost someone?
I think so. I mean, sometimes they're a little more private, but I think we can let people know that we're thinking about them. I think death days and loved ones' birthdays are a little different. So when I think about my mom's death day, it's a really hard day.
I don't like to think about it.
It's in January. It's the end of January. So I kind of start the year. It's a little heavy each year. But when I think about her death day, to me, that's almost a day that's about me and all the grief I've been carrying and how long I've carried it and how long I've missed her. Her birthday feels different. I kind of want to celebrate her more on her birthday. My girls help me make a cake. Sometimes we go shopping. We'll just do something fun for my mom. But the death day can be a little hard.
Yeah. I must admit, I avoid the death days like the plague. In my mind, it's a conscious, literal, pushing to the back and out of my mind. But birthdays, I'm like, okay, today would have been my dad's birthday, and he would have wanted me to have these shoes.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so
maybe you can think about the death days, though, as a way of honoring the time you've spent here without them, and honoring the grief you've carried, and honoring the love you have for them. So you could kind of reframe that day as making it a day to really honor yourself.
I hear you.
You're like, nope.
I'm like, I know. I'm like, in my mind, I'm kind of I'd rather, again, this is really interesting. I'd rather just work that day and just treat it like any other Wednesday or whatever it be. But that takes us back to our anxiety. So this was a really interesting scenario, because in my mind, I feel like, losing my father at 23, I felt this is something that actually I've never really expressed publicly or to many people. But after losing both my father and my mother, individually, there came a point where I felt fortified. I felt like their spirit had actually kind of like transferred into me, and I felt a little bit superhuman. So I felt like there were times when, and you said this earlier on in the episode, of it puts life into perspective. And I've always felt amidst the great tragedy and sadness and the loss that there was this moment where I could do anything. And I've always kind of used that moment. I'm not saying it's always going to be there with every person that I, come to lose in my life, but it was certainly there with my dad and definitely there with my mum. And I kind of like, there's this sense of just like feeling stronger and feeling that person is with me, but in a different way. And now I can kind of tackle something big. And so that weird perspective, but in the same sense, the other side of me is like, I think, I've never really probably acknowledged the amount of anxiety that grief has really, or the way in which anxiety has shown up in my life as a result of grief. So as a natural kind of like high achieving person, I've kind of always thrown myself back into, when my father died, back into track, returning to the track just a week, probably 2 weeks after he passed away, to set my sights on, becoming an Olympian, and very much like pushing all of those feelings away. And then, after my mother died, probably like frantically cleaning the house and things like that, really busying my mind with things that the outcomes were positive. But perhaps that
all makes sense, though. I mean, anxiety isn't always terrible. Anxiety can fuel us in a lot of ways. But I think the response that you had to achieve also gives you control, right? You're controlling something, like both your parents' deaths at such a young age. I assume that they were both young and not at their time yet either. Just gives you that awful feeling that the world is not under your control. It's so scary. It's so scary. And so what can you control, right? You can control your body. You can control achievement, success, drive, motivation. You can use all of those things. Some of the most anxious people I know are the most successful and high achieving people. We don't sleep. There's no sitting down for anxious people. There's so much to do. There's more to accomplish. Gives us the illusion of control. Because the scariest thing would be for people like us to really just sit and just stop what we're doing, not control anything, and let life happen. That's terrifying, right? And we also might feel a lot of things when we do that. When we're busy moving, achieving, we're not really feeling everything that's happening. But you were also, with all of your athleticism, you were able to probably process a lot and metabolize a lot through your body. We hold a lot of grief in our bodies.
Yeah, that's definitely, I would say, having sport as a real anchor was definitely a real positive outlet. Because it meant that every single day I was coming home having achieved something, whether that be like, an extra few centimeters in the shot put. And so what I was doing was almost like rebuilding myself from the ground up, but also in this way, really honoring my father, who was my number one fan, would take me to training when I was, a young child. And so I remember thinking, as much as it's my journey, it's also part of his journey. But that was really kind of like pressure free.
Yeah, but that's a beautiful, natural way to honor your grief and your dad. I think I like to say that we inherently know how to grieve, just as people, just as women know how to give birth. If a woman had to give birth in a forest, her body knows how to do it. We know how to grieve too. And you honoring your father like that is such a beautiful way that you just inherently knew how to do and connect with him and do something for him and in his honor, know that he would be proud of you. We've got to find those kinds of things when we're grieving to keep us connected.
What happens when you can't find those things? What have you noticed with perhaps your own grief and the people that you're helping through their grief and loss?
A lot of pain, a lot of existential kind of pain and suffering, anxiety as well. It can be hard to find those things. I work with a lot of people who've gone through just really catastrophic loss, children who've died, parents who are grieving, just really traumatic losses. And in the beginning of those kinds of losses, it's really hard to find meaning there's no meaning to be found in like losing a 7-year-old. It just feels like the world is ending, and you don't want there to ever become something positive of it or be able to be here without them. So there's a lot of resistance sometimes to that. I think we push off the acceptance of loss in many different ways. Acceptance doesn't mean that it's okay that they died. Acceptance means you're accepting the reality that you're living this life with them not here. But we find a lot of ways to push that away.
So do you feel like a lot of people hold a lot of guilt around grief? Because I've kind of noticed, definitely in people that are close to me, like this need for things to stay the same and almost preserve things how they were in order to honor someone. I'm very much of like perhaps a growth mindset. I'm okay with things in life changing. In fact, I kind of like welcome that in, and almost sometimes perhaps a little bit, I say a little bit too fast, but I don't think there is such a thing. Whereas I've noticed like definitely some people, I feel like a coping mechanism is just actually just dead stop. And if I can keep everything in this tight little box and, keep the room the same and all of those things and not change anything, then that might be another form of control, perhaps.
Absolutely, it is. That's exactly what it is. It's going back to that control idea. But that doesn't work, obviously. It really doesn't. I think it's absolutely okay to hold on to certain things. And I know people who've kept up a child's bedroom for a period of time or a long time. Or I have a client whose mom died, and her mom had this great walk-in closet, and they've kept it kind of preserved. And my client will go in there and just be in the midst of that walk-in closet with her mom's purses and shoes and dresses, and like, oh, I would give anything to have that of my mom.
Yeah.
So those things are okay. But I think when we try to remain the same person that we were before the loss, that's where that existential incongruence comes. We have to let loss change us.
That's a great point. I feel like I'm always the person when it comes to loss that's like very practical. Okay, let's get the clothes and let's do all the things. Because in my mind, like there's no replacing the person and the spirit and the love. And so I'm like, let's just deal with the reality and the physical things that, we now have to deal with. Now, you wrote a memoir, The Rules of Inheritance. What's the book about?
That's my first book. It's like my first baby. It's about my parents. It's about my whole journey. It's really the whole story of coming through those losses. It's funny that you asked me about the stages earlier, because I do talk about the stages a lot. Anxiety, the missing stage, and Rules of Inheritance is structured in the 5 stages. Kubler-Ross's 5 stages. So it has those 5 sections, and you see me going through all of them. But it's really because by the time I wrote that book, I was already working as a grief counselor in hospice. And everyone has always clung to those stages. People know the stages. If they know anything about grief, they know about the stages. And so I kind of wanted to meet people where they were and then expand their ideas beyond there.
And with regards to inheritance, this is one thing that, I've had to live through with my siblings. Do you think there's a way to go about inheritance and what you leave behind and a way to think about those things? And like, if you could give people advice on, structuring and the amount of work that they do while they are alive, what would you say?
Oh gosh. Well, it's funny, that title, my best friend of now like 14 years, she said when she first met me that she heard the title of the book, The Rules of Inheritance, and thought it was like this wealthy girl coming through her fortune. And I didn't inherit anything. I inherited a lot of grief and sorrow and a mess of grief and just, but I think we inherit a lot more than money and property. We inherit traits, and we inherit trauma, and we inherit stories, and we inherit emotions, and like all kinds of things, So it was really, the title was really about me grappling with this inheritance of being in the world without the people who brought me in. And in terms of what we can do practically, I'm sure lots, but that's not quite my forte.
What's your perspective on the idea of grief work versus the idea that grief is something that we overcome?
I don't know if we overcome grief. I really think about grief as something that we learn to live with and we learn to embrace. I'm not actively grieving my mother anymore, my father, but I carry their losses with me. They impact me every day. I am raising a bunch of kids. I wish my parents had gotten to meet them. I think about my mom when I'm cooking. Her loss is with me. That loss is with me, but I'm not always grieving it. I'm not sure we have to overcome it, but we learn how to kind of grow with it and to let it, inform us in many different ways, which I think is the goal and something really beautiful and important. As for grief work, it can be work. It's hard. It really is hard. I think, again, we really try to resist it in many ways. If you're a scheduling kind of person, if you're an organized person, schedule time for your grief. I tell clients this all the time. Put it in the calendar. Maybe it's a Saturday morning at 10 a.m. You know you don't have much going on the rest of the day. Get out a photo album. Sit down and write your person a letter. Just have a good cry. Tell a story about them to someone. And know that that is your little grief time. When we do that, it eases up all the stuff that we're carrying. We feel it in our chests all week. We've just got this, growing sense of weight. If you can ease it off with a little time spent grieving, then that's great. And if you're worried about having like a breakdown with your grief, you won't if you're scheduling it,
If let's say I walk into your clinic and I've, just suffered a huge loss, whether that be person or job, where do you start? Like, what are the first questions you ask somebody when, you know that they've come to you because they're really suffering?
Usually it's just tell me what's bringing you in. And I just am so curious to hear where they start. Most often people will start with the loss itself, what's happened, who they lost, what they lost, and how it's impacting their day right now. But I really also want to go back and hear everything beforehand. I would want to know with you all about like your relationship with your dad and your mom and what their relationship was with each other, your siblings, your home life. All of those things inform who you are and how you grieve, how you're going to carry them with you. If there's complicated relationships, that's one thing I do want to say is that there are so many complicated relationships in life. So when we're grieving, we're not always grieving a really loving relationship that was perfect. I hear about complicated relationships almost more than I do loving ones. My mom and I had a great relationship, but lots of people have complicated relationships with their moms, and then their mom dies and they feel like maybe they're not allowed to grieve because they didn't have a great relationship with them. We still get to grieve if it's complicated.
Do you feel like it's harder to grieve if a relationship was complicated?
Absolutely.
Do you feel like, is it more painful?
There's just more stuff that you've got to kind of sift through and sort through in order to get to the more kind of sad, pure grief. You might end up really ultimately grieving a relationship you didn't get to have with that person or what you always wanted from them. But first you've got to sort through the guilt or the anger or the resentment. I mean, we can grieve for even like abusive relationships. There's so much we grieve. We don't want to necessarily, but it's still there and we're allowed to. We get to grieve.
Men and women, do they grieve the same?
A really good question. No. Yes and no. I mean, I think there's some cultural influence on men and women and how much we're allowed to grieve or how we are, in what ways we're allowed to grieve. But I think that just very generally speaking, this obviously doesn't apply to every single man or woman, but generally speaking, I think men are much more action-oriented in their grief. They want homework all the time as clients.
What kind of homework?
Like, I don't know. They just think they need homework. I don't always give homework, so I'm always trying to come up with some homework for the guys. Maybe it's journaling. Maybe it's like having a conversation with someone. Maybe it's having a cry. But guys really like to kind of get out and move through their grief. Women tend to be much more socially oriented in their grief. They come together. They like to be in support groups. They come to retreats. I run support groups. I offer retreats. Almost always all women. Men are invited. They're never there.
Wow. Why do you think that is?
I think part of it is cultural influence, and part of it is just maybe the way that they operate in a different way. I think women really like to communicate and talk and kind of steep in our stuff, and men don't do that as much. I think they're a little more logical and pragmatic. I was talking with a woman who they lost a baby, and she was saying that in her grief process in the first 9 months, 10 months or whatever, she wanted to just sit on the floor in her bedroom in the dark and cry every day. And her husband went out cycling every day, and that was like his way of dealing. And he really wanted her to come cycling, and she really wanted him to sit on the floor in the bedroom, and neither of them wanted to do the other's thing
they
at all.
Go for a bike ride and then sit on the floor.
I think they eventually tried to do a little of each, but just that always comes to mind when people ask me about men and women. We just kind of metabolize it in a different way. I don't think there's a right or wrong way. I think we have to get to know our own grief process, right? Like if you don't like death days, that's great. You don't have to force yourself to get all into the death day and do anything. There's no perfect way for everybody. We're all going to do this differently, but find what does work. Ask yourself the question, am I allowing space for my grief? Am I honoring my person? Am I examining the way this loss has changed me? Ask yourself those questions. And if you can answer truthfully that you are doing those things, then it doesn't matter exactly how you're doing it.
How does grief change you?
There are sometimes very uncomfortable practical ways that it can change us. We may have to move homes. We may lose money. We may lose a child care partner. We may lose a social system. There's a lot of different ways that it can change us on some of those levels. But then it can also just change in terms of our sense of safety in the world, our sense of predictability and reliability. We can, again, that landscape of what we thought life was about can really change. It can change our spiritual and religious views. You can go from being someone who had an absolute devout faith to questioning that, or you can be someone who never had faith to wanting it. There's so many different ways it changes those things, and it absolutely changes our relationships.
How so? What's the most common thing you see in relationship shifts when somebody is dealing with loss?
There's a phrase I hear in the grief world that says, in grief, friends become strangers and strangers become friends. And that's an interesting thing that happens, not always, but often, where the people that you most thought would show up for you, or the people that you were so close to and you thought you could talk to about anything, are suddenly the people that can't hold space for your grief. They're not showing up, or every time you try to talk about it, it just isn't working.
Why is that?
Again, people are afraid to talk about it, right? So sometimes, even your best friend or your sister or your aunt, the people you really thought were going to show up for you just can't. They can't be there. They're not showing up. And it's so painful. And then you meet a stranger, at the grocery store or in a class or so whatever, and you connect with them on such a deep level because of the loss. And you have this new friend who knows you in this really intimate way. And that happens often. So I think that thinking about that in terms of relationships, but also it impacts, your relationships, your day-to-day relationships too, your partner, your spouse, the rest of your family. You said you had brothers, I bet you're all grieving differently. I bet you all experienced the loss of your parents in different ways and displayed it and were able to talk to each other in different ways, and that it impacted your relationship, both good and bad. But one of the things that I think is beautiful about it is, again, it can make you realize what matters, right? So you may get rid of some people that don't. You're like, oh, I don't need these people in my life.
Don't you just end up grieving those people that you have to get rid of as well?
Not necessarily, because I think grief can be this thing that makes you remember, what matters to you? How do you want to spend your time? And you may find that you have some relationships that aren't serving you. And so now's a great time to just you don't care anymore. You're getting rid of those. And then you realize that you want to deepen some other relationships, or you start to pursue more meaningful relationships. So there's a beauty there.
Claire, what happens on one of your grief retreats?
They're really powerful experiences. I do them up in Northern California, and there's usually about 20 to 25 people, almost always women. Men are invited. And we come together and we meet in large groups and small groups. It's a real mix of losses. There's people who've lost parents, people who've lost children, people who've lost partners, siblings. Some people have had multiple losses, both parents. And we really deconstruct what people think they know about grief, how they've been going about the process, help them understand it a little more, get more comfortable with it. It's so different from one-on-one work. When I meet with clients one-on-one, it's usually once a week, once every 2 weeks. We can only get so far in an hour, right? We can touch into some pain points, but then the session's over and I see them again in a week or two. And then we have to do the work to get back to that pain point to really do the work. In the 3 to 4 days of a retreat, you're actually staying in it the whole time. So you're really moving through some of the harder pieces. There's also this sense of connection, what it's like to be in a room full of everyone is grieving. Because I think grief can be really lonely. A lot of people around you don't recognize how you're carrying it, how it's impacting your life. And so you're kind of walking through life all the time feeling like everyone else is living their regular life and I'm carrying this grief with me and it feels invisible. When you sit in a room with everybody grieving, it can just feel really good. You kind of feel like all of yourself is present and seen at the same time.
I remember when I lost my mum, actually taking a walk just up the street and one of my friends calling me. And I remember just feeling completely and utterly lost. I just knew I had to get out of the house and I just walked. And I remember my friend calling me and being like, how did you know I needed to speak to someone? I think, I can really resonate with that sense of just like, feeling alone and feeling, and not also wanting to dump your sadness on people, especially when it's, such a lot and there's such a heavy load to carry. How do you know when you're done grieving, Claire? Like, when do you graduate? When does this stop?
That's a really interesting question. I think that there's different levels of being done. There's the ability to kind of be in your life again and carry the loss. Like you'll notice that I think some losses really take the floor out, right? Like it's important to actually stop your life for a minute and just take time to grieve and maybe close all the blinds and maybe your home and your life is different for a year or two, maybe with really big losses. When you start to emerge and you're in your life again and you can have gratitude for being here, you can hold both the grief and the beauty. That's kind of, a marker. I think that's an important place to be. But I think when we try to rush through it and think we're done, often it comes back and finds us. But even when you've reached a certain level of acceptance and being able to hold the loss, there's always something that will sometimes spark it down the road. I bet if you become a mother, your grief will come back in a few ways. Not necessarily a debilitating way, but you will suddenly have a new grief for your mom and your dad because you're now a mom and you're raising a kid that they are not going to meet. And so your grief will be there. And it's not a bad thing, but often we think we're like doing fine and that was, you've put that behind you and then your life changes in some way and the grief is there again. But I always ask people to get curious about it. What's it here to teach you this time? What's it here to offer you?
When it comes to triggers, this is a word that, you brought up earlier. What are the most common things that kind of re-trigger that grief and that pain and that loss? What are the common things that you see?
More loss, other loss. That's a big one, right? You go through another loss. Maybe it's you were here in LA and you lost your house in the fires. That could bring up old grief. I talked to a woman actually who had lost her childhood home had burned down. Her home had not. She was an adult, but her mom had died years ago. And it was the house that her mother had just loved and worked so hard to create for her and her brother. And she lost that home and it brought back all the grief of her mom, so we could have a trigger like that. I went through a divorce in my mid-30s and it brought up a lot of grief again for me. That was a very triggering time. It was like the dismantling of my new immediate family brought up grief of my old loss of my immediate family. People, again, grieving COVID. People will be so dismissive about COVID these days or say it's not real. That can be so triggering for someone who lost someone to COVID. You know, there's all kinds of things. Or you could just see someone who looks like your person or a song comes on or, all of those things. I remember I was getting off an airplane once years ago and I was getting off coach and there was a woman coming out of first class and we were just facing each other waiting to get off and she looked so much like my mother. And we were stuck there for a good 5 minutes and I just couldn't stop staring at her. She looked so much like my mom. I wanted to touch her. And we finally deboarded and I was just in tears and it had been so unexpected, right? I was fine. I was just getting off a plane and then there I am crying.
I can't imagine. I would just have to.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
I really wanted to touch her.
Did you speak to her?
No, I couldn't. I was too overcome.
So the really, odd thing in my family was I found out that my mum had other siblings.
Oh, wow.
So she was one of 5. And I found out that there were other siblings on her side of the family. Wow. And I think there were 4 siblings. And my mum and her sisters, 5 girls. And then all of a sudden I was on FaceTime with another 3 family members.
Oh, wow.
And one of them looked just like my mum. And I was just like, and then one of them looked like my auntie. And I was just like, this is bizarre. Wow. Like, it was the weirdest thing. She'd never told me. It was like, you know, like a really real secret.
Wow.
And so it's true, isn't it, that we can really get to know people a little bit better as well in death. And I just had no idea that, you know, all of this new information would come to light.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Was anything about it comforting, or was it upsetting, or?
It was just bizarre because I was like, there's another one. And, you know, my mum having had, like, she's got 4 sisters already. I see so much of her in them, in particular my Auntie Carol. And so, like, seeing my Auntie Carol always feels like home. And she always said that she was my second mum. And my cousin, we were born nearly on the same day as well. We said they gave the wrong child back because we were very similar. And but yeah, seeing them, it was just like, it was almost like it was like the Matrix, like something that you shouldn't have seen.
Wow, that's
it was
wild.
So bizarre. You know, we talked about grief from a perspective of losing people. But I would say, you know, obviously we know grief can come in so many different forms. One of the ways in which I think grief has probably entered my life was the end of my sporting career, which is really interesting. We talked about the planning for the end of life, but what about the planning for, you know, big life changes, career transitions?
Absolutely. That's big and real grief. What did it feel like?
For me, I think something, again, I was in control of. So I noticed for a lot of my friends, there's definitely, you know, it can be a real rough patch for a lot of elite athletes. A lot of the time, elite athletes can suffer career-ending injuries, in which case that grief comes very, very quick and very, very hard.
Weren't prepared at all for that.
Absolutely, completely unexpected. And all of a sudden, you know, you're no longer an athlete. You can't even perform. And that wasn't my story. My story was much more reaching a feeling of my peak, my athletic peak, and having given all of my energy. I don't feel like I gave all of my potential to sport. I feel like I actually got out at the point at which I could see my performance start to dwindle. And also my energy levels dwindling. I'm like, I don't know that I can sustain this level of effort for another 4 years and another Olympic cycle, and the amount of work that it took. So I was able to kind of exit and, you know, move into television and presenting with relative ease. And looking back, and I was 27 when I retired, which is very, very young. Most people have gone on to at least their 30s. I definitely got out early. I'm thankful that I did. And I think it's kind of paid off further down the line, like almost leaving almost at the top, or just a little bit past the top, but pretty much at the top of your game. And
Did you feel sadness about letting go of your career, of that career?
I think, honestly, I think my family felt more sad than I did. I remember my mum and my nan, like, my mum, what are you going to do now? Like, are you sure you don't just want it? And I'm like, I've got no desire whatsoever to do another heptathlon. I could not imagine myself running another 800-meter race. I thought there's so many more things I want to do. And then the other thing was, like, just having the same monotonous conversations at training every single day. I was like, I'm losing brain cells sitting here throwing shot puts and jumping into sand pits.
Yeah.
Like, there was a part of me that really needed to expand. And then dealing also with the grief from my family of, oh, well, it'd be so nice to see you on telly and all of these things. And, you know, they were like, oh, we're not going to have like a famous niece or whatever anymore. And that was, I couldn't care less. I was like, let me go and live my life.
Well, it sounds like you moved into that transition with a lot of intention and awareness and some planning too, which I think really helps.
Yeah.
I think for those who kind of have an injury that ends their career, that's a whole different grief process. You know, I think there's a lot of pain and anguish and surprise around that. And it's not dissimilar to when we experience a sudden death of a person as opposed to an anticipated death of someone who's had a long illness or is at the end of a long life. We can have more time to come to terms with it. When we're faced with any kind of sudden loss, it's really hard. It takes a lot of time to wrap our heads around it. There's shock, there's trauma, there's denial, there's this ripping away of an identity that we had, that I think requires a lot of grieving, crying, anger, working through the regret stage and thinking about the what ifs, what if I just not made that one move or whatever. And then I think ritual too, and honor, like how do you ritualize that transition and that experience of being that person and that athlete, and how do you honor that version of yourself? We have to move towards those things eventually, but there's a lot of other big feelings we've got to sift through initially.
100%. I can honestly say now at this stage of my life, I'm enjoying having a running club. I'm like falling back in love with running again. There was definitely a time where we'd definitely broken up and running was blocked. I did not, didn't read the messages, was not trying to engage. Definitely had to kind of like go and live more of my life and the parts of my life that hadn't been nurtured because
now
of the
you've got a new
spent.
relationship with it.
Absolutely.
That's cool.
And now I'm like just really excited about sharing it with other people as well.
Yeah,
So that's
really
good
cool.
fun. Yeah. Claire, let's say Claire, what advice would you have for somebody who's literally recently suffered a big loss?
I think really check in with yourself. Are you allowing that grief to come out? Are you stuffing it away? What are you feeling? When are you feeling it? Who around you is supporting you? Are you communicating with people about what you need? I think we receive a lot of messages, again, from the outside world, whether it's cultural or it's on television or it's our workplace or it's even sometimes our own family. We get kind of bombarded with messages about how we're supposed to grieve. So what I always really want people to do is think for themselves, like push away all of those messages and think, how do you need to grieve? What do you need right now? Do you need boundaries? Do you need to start saying no to people? Do you need to take some time off of work? Do you need to exercise and take care of your body? We don't take care of our bodies often when we're grieving. How is your body doing physically? The more that we take care of ourselves on a physical level, the more emotions we can withstand in the grief process. So that's really important. So really seeing, what do you need? Do you need a support group? Do you need to talk to someone? Do you need to read a book about grief? Give yourself permission to grieve, I think, is the really big thing.
I remember when I was going through it, I went to see a counsellor, therapist, and he recommended that I take a vacation. And at the time I was a poor student. I was like, there is nowhere I can go. Like, I don't have any resources. Are there any resources that you could recommend for people who just feel so stuck in their current situation that there's nowhere to go? Is there anywhere that provides some sort of solace or financial support for people who are grieving, where they feel like perhaps they need to take time off work, perhaps they need a break?
There's a few different things here and there for financial support. Unfortunately, there's not enough. I can send you some things too that maybe you can put in the show notes later. But in terms of not having, it's a real truth that we don't always have the resources to take time to grieve, right? You've got a busy schedule. You've got work that you have to pay bills for. You've got kids to take care of. I meet so many people in like the midst of their busy lives who need to find time to grieve. Do that thing where you just schedule a little bit of time for yourself to grieve. Really like putting it in the calendar if you need to, but even just taking an hour once a week to really allow that grief some space and some breathing room is important. But also communicating. We are so bad at asking for help, right? Letting some people around you know that you need help, that you need some time and space. I think often, like we said earlier, people are afraid to say the wrong thing. They don't know what to do for people who are grieving. Most people around you will jump at the chance to be able to do something for you. So ask for some support, ask for some help. Let people know that you're grieving and that you really need some extra anything, resources. Come over and take my dog out so I can take a nap, or take care of my kid for a little bit so I can just grieve. People would be more than willing to do that if we just ask.
Claire, thank you so much for joining us on the Slay podcast. I feel like your books, your advice, your retreats are going to help so many people. I really, really appreciate it. I look forward to us meeting again soon and perhaps working through some more pain and suffering.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for holding space for grief. Thank you for being so honest too about your own personal grief and losses. It's really important. I think the more we can talk about it like that, the more people feel that permission.
That concludes this episode of Slay. Stay tuned for more empowering discussions on female health, fitness, and life. You can follow Claire at Claire Bidwell-Smith on Instagram. Claire, what have you got coming up?
My next grief retreat is in August up in Northern California, and there's still a few spots available. You can find more information on my website.
Love that. And you can follow me at Louise Hazel on social media. You can also follow Slay at Slay Athletic Club. And don't forget to subscribe to the Slay podcast if you haven't done so already on YouTube. You can get fit at home using the Slay app. You can download that now for free from the App Store to join our online community. And lastly, if you're in Los Angeles, come and join us on Saturdays at 9:30 a.m. at the Hollywood Bowl for Slay Athletic Club, our new run club experience for women. Hit the link in my bio on Instagram to register.